Clinton County Board of Elections, Precinct Election Official Training, November 3rd, 2020 General Election. Election Day Processes and Procedures. This page contains the contact information for staff members at the Board of Elections. You might want to write down phone numbers and email addresses should you need to contact any of these staff members before, during, or after Election Day. Polling location changes. We have 3 new polling locations. They include Blanchester Middle School, Clinton Highland Joint Fire District Community Room, and Cornerstone Baptist Church. The polling locations at Blanchester Church of Christ, Blanchester Senior Center, New Vienna Church of Christ, and the Presbyterian Church in Wilmington are now closed. Precinct change cards were mailed to all affected voters in August of 2020. Polling location ads were run in the Wilmington News Journal on September 18th and October 31st. Signs will be at the old polling locations to direct voters to the new locations. There are no party-specific ballots because this is a general election. We will utilize 14 polling locations and 36 precincts. We will be fully staffed at all polling locations for this election, including some extra workers at some locations to assist with line management, curbside voting, etc. COVID-19 protocols are in place and must be adhered to throughout the day. We are committed to the safety of our precinct election officials and staff and invested in personal protective equipment for all workers, cleaning supplies for each polling location, and a cleaning crew who will visit each polling location regularly throughout the day on Election Day. PEOs must wear a face mask and in some cases a face shield. Voters are asked to wear face masks. If a voter does not have a mask, one will be provided for them. If a voter refuses to wear a mask that is provided to them, they will be asked to return to their card to curbside vote. COVID protocols. Prior to reporting to work, precinct election officials are required to take their temperature. Any temperature of 99.9 or up will prevent one from working as a precinct election official. Precinct election officials with a temperature of 99.9 and up should notify the Board of Elections as soon as possible so a precinct election official replacement can be dispatched. Precinct election officials who are sick, have tested positive for COVID-19, or have recently had close contact with a person with COVID-19 should stay home. Precinct election officials are required to wear a face covering for all in-person voting. Exceptions will be made on a case-by-case basis. Allowable exceptions include a documented condition or disability that prevents the wearing of a face covering, or the precinct election official needs to communicate with someone who is hearing impaired or has another disability where seeing the mouth is essential to communication. Information will be provided on the proper use, removal, and washing of face coverings. Certain duties will require the use of additional personal protection equipment, including tabletop plexiglass shields, face shields, and rubber gloves. Precinct election officials will be trained in the appropriate use of this equipment. Where social distancing is not possible, a clear plastic barrier or face shield will be used in conjunction with a face covering. Precinct election officials should wash hands frequently for at least 20 seconds with soap and water. If soap and water are not readily available, an alcohol-based hand sanitizer that contains at least 60% alcohol is an effective remedy. Precinct election officials should cover coughs and sneezes with a tissue or use the inside of their elbow. Used tissue should be thrown in the trash and hands washed immediately with soap and water for at least 20 seconds. If soap and water are not readily available, precinct election officials should use hand sanitizer that contains at least 60% alcohol. Communal eating is prohibited. Prepackaged or single-serving food or snack is permitted. Precinct election officials, one Democrat and one Republican, must ride together in the same vehicle to the Board of Elections on election night after the polls close to return supplies, and ballots. They should distance themselves as much as possible and continue to wear a face mask and/or face covering. Voters must be encouraged to use face coverings while inside the polling location and/or in line to vote, although compliance is ultimately voluntary. If a voter refuses to wear a face covering after being asked, precinct election officials must offer the option of curbside voting. If they insist on voting in the polling location without a face covering, they must be permitted to do so. Refusal by voters to wear a face mask or face covering cannot impact the voting process or the person's right to vote. All polling locations have been assessed and redesigned to be able to accommodate all COVID-19 safety protocols. Whenever possible, the flow of the voting transaction is designed to be in one linear direction with separate entrances and exits into and out of the polling location. Wherever possible, polling location doors will be propped open to increase air circulation. Opening and closing the polls. All precinct election officials should arrive at their assigned polling location by 5:30 a.m. If a precinct election official does not report by 5:30 a.m., call the Board of Elections immediately. Use your opening the polls checklist to complete all tasks. The checklist will make sure you correctly complete all required tasks before the polls open. Your lead precinct election official can assign tasks to each team member for greater efficiency. Though you must have one precinct election official from each party present when opening the red ballot bag, you may begin to set up the other equipment and supplies as soon as you arrive. All precinct election officials must take the oath of office and sign under the oath on the provided lines. All precinct election officials must sign the ethics and payroll forms. Ensure all of your equipment was delivered, including the poll pad, ClearCast ballot scanner with ballot bag, Clear Access ADA voting machine, and Votomatics, also known as voting booths. Use the instructions found in the Opening the Polls checklist to set up and activate all equipment. Post the flags outside of the polling location to mark the 100-foot area where campaigning is prohibited. The large flag should be placed at the entrance, and two small flags should be placed 100 feet from the entrance. Ensure all required notices are posted prior to opening the polls at 6:30 a.m. If you have any issues while opening the polls, including missing supplies, equipment problems, precinct election official no-shows, etc., call the Board of Elections at 382-3537 immediately. Polls open at 6:30 a.m. sharp. Who is allowed in the polling place? Voters, children of voters who are not of voting age, persons checking the 11 and 4 list, observers, but only with a certificate of appointment, members of the media, but only with credentials, the Clinton County Sheriff's Department, other persons assigned by the Board of Elections or Secretary of State's office, and finally, a person assisting a voter with the voting process. Who can help a voter who needs assistance? If a voter declares they are unable to mark their ballot due to blindness, disability, or illiteracy, they can have anyone of their choosing assist except the voter's employer, an agent of the voter's employer, an officer or agent of the voter's union, or a candidate appearing on the ballot. If a voter asks for assistance from precinct election officials, there must be both a Democratic precinct election official and a Republican precinct election official who assists the voter. Any person who provides assistance in marking the ballot is forbidden from providing any information on how the voter voted. The news media is allowed in your polling location, and they are permitted to film or take pictures as long as they are not impeding or disrupting the voting process. You must ensure the media do not violate a voter's privacy. They must have valid credentials from their media outlet. If they ask questions, we recommend you do not answer them, but instead direct them to contact the Board of Elections office. They may interview any willing voters outside of the polling location as long as they do not disturb or impede voters or the process. Observers may be appointed to observe the casting and counting of ballots at one or multiple precincts on Election Day. Observers must have a certificate of appointment issued by their appointing authority to be allowed to observe at a polling location. They must have a copy of that certificate of appointment to present to the voting location manager at the polling location to observe at that polling location. Once the observer presents their certificate of appointment, they should be sworn in or affirmed by the voting location manager. Observers are permitted to be present from the opening until the closing of the polls. Accordingly, an observer would be permitted to be present from 1/2 hour before the polling place opens through the time the poll workers for that precinct finish closing the polls and leave the polling location. Observers cannot handle paperwork or operate election equipment. While they can ask you questions, they cannot be disruptive. If you have any issues with an observer, do not confront them. Call the Board of Elections and we will resolve the situation. One COVID note regarding observers. Observers must be directed to practice social distancing and wear a facial covering. An observer who is unable to secure PPE may be provided such equipment by the Board of Elections. An observer who refuses to wear a mask or face covering is considered to be obstructing voting and must be positioned such that they are 6 feet from everyone else at all times. Closing the polls. The voting location manager will announce the close of polls at 7:30 p.m. using their cell phone as the official time. If a court order requires the polls to be open past 7:30 p.m., you'll be contacted and given specific instructions. Anyone in line by 7:30 p.m. gets to vote a regular ballot. You may place a PEO at the end of the line if necessary. Voters arriving after 7:30 p.m. will have to vote a provisional ballot that will be segregated from other provisional ballots in a designated white envelope with an orange label reading "Provisional ballots voted after 7:30 p.m. Use your closing the polls checklist to make sure you complete all required tasks correctly. After the polls close, you can take down all vote-o-matics, but do not take them down before the polls close. Using the instructions found in your closing the polls checklist, shut down the ClearCast ballot scanner. The lead precinct election official will assign closing duties to the precinct teams and will close out the election day on the ClearCast ballot scanner and print 2 closing reports. One report will be posted at the polling location for the public. The other report will be signed and placed in a data pouch to be returned to the Board of Elections. Complete the ballot reconciliation chart. If you have problems balancing, call the Board of Elections for help at 382-3537. When packing the red ballot bag, follow the instructions in your closing the polls checklist so you don't forget anything and place it in the proper order. The closing the polls checklist will also list everything you should place in the blue supply bag. Most likely, if it did not go in the red ballot bag, it goes in the blue supply bag. Don't throw anything away. Ballot reconciliation may have changed since the last election you worked. The lead and assistant precinct election official will close out the election day on the ClearCast ballot scanner and print 2 closing reports. The ClearCast canvas ballot bag will be opened by the lead and assistant precinct election official and ballots removed and sorted by precinct and split. While ballot reconciliation is taking place, the rest of the precinct team will be working to tear down the polling location signs, vote-o-matics, etc. The lead precinct election official and assistant precinct election official will work together to count ballots and complete the ballot reconciliation report. Voted ballots will be placed in the envelope marked Voted Ballots and placed inside the red bag for return to the Board of Elections. The empty ClearCast scanner canvas ballot bag will be sealed and the seal number recorded. The red bag contains voted ballots. It must remain under the supervision of a precinct election official at all times and carefully handled as it is returned to the Board of Elections. This is an example of a ballot reconciliation chart. You might want to look it over before Election Day so you're familiar with the information that is required to reconcile ballots. Here's an example of a more completed ballot reconciliation chart for you to look at prior to Election Day. Precinct election official basic expectations, end of Election Day. Polls close at 7:30 p.m. All precinct election officials are expected to stay and help reconcile ballots and pack up the supplies and poll pad. Your lead precinct election official will assign tasks to each precinct election official. After the ballots are reconciled, the ballots are locked in a red supply bag. Supplies are packed into the blue bag. The polling location binder is closed, and the green poll pad case is packed. Those 4 items are loaded into a precinct election official's car. The ballots in the red bag must be under the watchful eye of the precinct election officials at all times. That includes both a Democrat and Republican precinct election official. A Republican precinct election official and Democratic precinct election official must ride in the same car with the ballots back to the Board of Elections. Pro PEO tip. To account for this, precinct teams have planned who is going to be responsible for this important task in advance, and those 2 precinct election officials have met at the Board of Elections in the morning. They drive together in one car to the polling location, then the precinct election officials both have their cars there to drive home after a long day of being an election superhero. This is the election schedule for early voting at the Clinton County Board of Elections. We encourage all precinct election officials to either vote early by absentee or vote early in person at the Board of Elections office. Though some may be assigned to their home polling location, we cannot guarantee that you will be assigned to that polling location when Election Day comes due to
Click the link in the notes under this video to take the quiz.